Hey, Springfield fans! Welcome to the ultimate Simpsons Yes or No quiz. We've got 50 questions lined up to test your Springfield smarts, so let's get started. Does Homer love donuts? Yes or no? And the answer is yes. Donuts! Is Marge's hair blue? Yes or no? The answer is yes, it's blue. That iconic beehive. Does Bart have a sister named Lisa? Yes or no? And yes, he does. Lisa is his little sister. Is Springfield Elementary's principal named Skinner? Yes or no? And the answer is yes, Principal Seymour Skinner. Does Ned Flanders own a store called the Leftorium? Yes or no? And yes, he does. Lefties, unite. Is Milhouse Bart's cousin? Yes or no? And the answer is yes, they're indeed cousins. Does Mr. Burns say excellent? Yes or no? And yes, he does. Excellent. Is Krusty the Clown a news reporter? Yes or no? And the answer is no, he's a clown. Does Lisa play the saxophone? Yes or no? And yes, she does. Jazz it up, Lisa! Is Maggie the oldest Simpson child? Yes or no? And the answer is no, she's the youngest. Does Homer work at the Springfield nuclear power plant? Yes or no? And yes, he does. Safety inspector, no less. Is Barney Gumble Homer's best friend? Yes or no? And the answer is yes, he is. Drinking buddies for life. Is Moe's last name Sislak? Yes or no? And yes, it is. Moe Sislak. Does Ralph Wiggum say I'm in danger? Yes or no? And the answer is yes, he does. Poor Ralphie. Is Itchy the mouse in Itchy and Scratchy? Yes or no? And yes, he is. Watch out, Scratchy. Does Chief Wiggum have a daughter? Yes or no? And the answer is no, he has a son, Ralph. Is Patty Bouvier one of Marge's sisters? Yes or no? And yes, she is. Patty and Selma. Does Apu run a grocery store called Quick E-Mart? Yes or no? And the answer is yes, he does. Thank you, come again. Is Milhouse's last name Van Houten? Yes or no? And yes, it is. Milhouse Van Houten. Is Hans Moleman over 100 years old? Yes or no? And the answer is no, he's not that old. Is Lisa a vegetarian? Yes or no? And yes, she is. Proudly so. Does Nelson Muntz say, haha? Yes or no? And the answer is yes, he does. Classic Nelson. Is Sideshow Bob Bart's best friend? Yes or no? And no, he's Bart's nemesis. Does Homer say dough when he makes a mistake? Yes or no? And the answer is, yes, he does. Doe! Is Dr. Hibbert the family doctor? Yes or no? And yes, he is. Dr. Hibbert. We are halfway through, folks. Keep going strong. Does Comic Book Guy own the android's dungeon? Yes or no? And the answer is, yes, he does. Comic Book Guy. Is groundskeeper Willie's first name William? Yes or no? And yes, it is. William McDougal. Is Krusty the Clown's real name Herschel Kristofsky? Yes or no? And the answer is, yes, it is. Herschel Kristofsky. Is Rod Flanders the younger brother of Todd Flanders? Yes or no? And yes, he is. Rod and Todd. Is Mo Sislak's tavern called Moe's? Yes or no? And the answer is, yes, it is. Moe's Tavern. Does Ralph Wiggum's father work as the school janitor? Yes or no? And no, he's the police chief. Is Lenny Leonard a nuclear technician at the power plant? Yes or no? And the answer is, yes, he is. Lenny Leonard. Is Carl Carlson's best friend Lenny Leonard? Yes or no? And yes, he is. Lenny and Carl. Is Disco Stew often seen at the local disco? Yes or no? And the answer is, yes, he is. Disco Stew? Does Santa's little helper belong to the Simpson family? Yes or no? And yes, he does. The family dog. Is Itchy a cat and Itchy and Scratchy? Yes or no? And the answer is no. Itchy's the mouse. Does Patty Bouvier have a twin sister named Selma? Yes or no? And yes, she does. Patty and Selma. Is Martin Prince a genius student at Springfield Elementary? Yes or no? And the answer is, yes, he is. Martin Prince. Is Sideshow Mel Krusty's sidekick? Yes or no? And yes, he is. Sideshow Mel. Is Kent Brockman a news anchor in Springfield? Yes or no? And the answer is, yes, he is. Kent Brockman. Does Mr. Burns have a bear named Bobo? Yes or no? And yes, he does. Mr. Burns' teddy bear. Is Santa's little helper a cat? Yes or no? And the answer is, no, he's a dog. Is Snowball 2 the Simpson family's dog? Yes or no? And no, Snowball 2 is their cat. Does Mo often prank call Bart? Yes or no? And the answer is no, it's Bart who prank calls Mo. Does Nelson Muntz have a crush on Lisa? Yes or no? And yes, he does. Aw, young love. Is Dr. Nick's catchphrase, "Hi, everybody"? Yes or no? And the answer is, yes, it is. Hi, Dr. Nick. Is Comic Book Guy's real name Jeff Albertson? Yes or no? And yes, it is. Jeff Albertson. Does Reverend Lovejoy preach at the First Church of Springfield? Yes or no? And yes, he does. Reverend Lovejoy. Is Marge the oldest Simpson child? Yes or no? And the answer is no, she's the mom. Does Mr. Burns have a cat as a pet? Yes or no? And yes, he does. Excellent. And that's it, folks. You've made it through all 50 questions. How did you do? Comment your score below and let us know what quizzes you'd like to see next. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this quiz with fellow quiz enthusiasts. Stay popping!